It's 1998, France has just won the World Cup, the Monica Lewinsky scandal erupts, and Maserati has just launched its first all-new car in 20 years. The 3200 GT was developed from 1993. That's when Fiat took over from De Tomaso. It marks the end of the bi-turbo, B-turbo era of cars, and it comes with a mixed heritage. On the one hand, the elegant design and the plush interior were very well received. On the other, a reputation for spiky handling and high running costs slightly dented its appeal. Maserati was always the most elegant of the Italian car makes, but much as I love their individuality, the B-turbo era of cars was more shell suit than Valentino. The 3200 brought back the elegance that Maserati had lost in the 80s. It was styled by Giugiaro, who fittingly also did some of Maserati's earlier classics, like the Merak, the Bora and the Ghibli. This was the world's first car with LED tail lights. Paolo Cantarella, who was then the head of Fiat, says that he was the one that saw that this technology was available and insisted that they use it on this car. Sadly, when it was updated to the 4200 with the Ferrari engine and the car was sold in the US, they were no longer able to use these. This is the only version that has those fabulous boomerang lights. The interior is characterised by sublime materials and a really attractive design. It is also roomier in the back than a BMW 850Ci or an Aston Martin DB7. It really does feel like a special place. You have the Maserati clock, you have an Alcantara headliner, leather covers absolutely everything. Unfortunately, the overall effect is slightly spoiled because of some of the Kinder Egg-like Fiat switchgear and the fact that aspects of it look like they were assembled by the child who ate the egg. I owned a 4200 Grand Sport, and to be honest, I wasn't always a fan of the way it drove. Let's take this out and see how it fares. Now, I am looking for other Maseratis to do videos on, so if you have one of the earlier cars from the 70s, 80s, 90s, do get in touch with me. This is the best address. It was never supposed to be known as the 3200. It was supposed to be called the Mistral, but unfortunately, Volkswagen owned that name already. So Maserati had to look back at their heritage and use the number nomenclature. This was the last Maserati to have one of its own engines. It was a quad-cam 3.2 litre twin-turbo V8, which was derived from the unit that was previously in the Shamal and the Evoluzione, the Quattroporte Evoluzione. It was supposed to produce about 370 horsepower, but in actual fact, these were putting out 400, even 420 on the dyno. So it's very odd that Maserati underreported the power. The figures kind of bear it out, because 0 to 60, 5.1 seconds. It seems that perhaps Ferrari were intent in some ways making sure that their new offspring, their little brother, didn't shame any of their cars. With 410 horsepower, it would have overshadowed the 355. So that's one of the reasons why it is claimed that it does that. But let's see how it feels now, going down the road on a full run through. They do have a reputation as being pretty quick, these. that is a really, really interesting power delivery. It has a mixture of really wanting to rev and shoot up the rev range, but then it has that incredible turbo-assisted mid-range power that is almost disconcerting. From about 3.5 onwards to 6, it just keeps on pulling. There doesn't seem to be much point in pushing it further than that. Now, at the time, they criticised it because the power delivery was quite binary, and these later cars, or in later years, they sort of reprogrammed that, and the throttle is supposed to be a little bit friendlier. Even then, it is still very, very sensitive to input, so quite a small movement on your right foot, and it really does respond instantly. And if you are up high in the rev range, say 4.5, where I presume the second turbo kicks in, it just really shoots forward with just a real vigour. It's incredibly smooth though. Now, sound-wise, of course, the turbos, I think, mute it a little bit. At lower revs, you do have the V8 sound. As you go through the rev range, it does have a muscular growl, but it is somewhat sort of tamed. It feels completely different to the Grand Sport that I had before in terms of power delivery. Chassis-wise, it still has a tautness that I remember from that car and that I wasn't always overly fond of, but I think this is a little bit more subtle, or supple even. So they came with the Assetto Corsa package, most of these, and this car had it originally, but it was reverted back to the original slightly taller setup, although it still has the thicker front anti-roll bar. And it does still resist lean really, really well, but it does feel more supple than my car. Again, this is a bumpy road, and it would have been a pain in my Grand Sport, but it's actually rather the good in this. It is quite difficult to keep that engine in check because it's just so eager to sort of spin up with that monstrous mid-range. You can see the traction control kicking in quite frequently, but it's not as abrupt as I'd been led to fear. Let's just take it up through the gears once again. Just the way it goes from 4,000 to 6 is, I wouldn't say bewildering, but wow, it's actually a lot of fun. Now, the steering is uber keen. I think in later cars it was even faster. To me, it's already quick here and it works pretty well. It's not incredibly feelsome, but you know what is going on with it. Now, if you break traction, it has a reputation of being really a little bit iffy, quite spiky. I didn't get there today, luckily, even with the traction control turned off there, but I didn't disrespect it. I wouldn't like to find out what it was like. The fact is, you get good communication front and back, so I think with a little bit more time, it's something I would probably chance. It's just that power delivery which would make it tricky, because it's just so ballistic above 4,000 RPM that if you happen to hit that at the wrong time, I think you might be in trouble. Now, the suspension on the 3200 was electronically adjustable. I think that they tend to fail, but apparently in this one it is working. So I've just put the sport button on, and let's see if I can feel a difference. And I think there's a little bit more stiffness there, but it's not an overwhelming change. It's not like on a 997 or something when you put in the sports setting and it becomes bone jarring. In many ways, I actually prefer this to my Grand Sport. I think driven hard, the Grand Sport would be better, and those Ferrari engines do sound absolutely beautiful. Rather than a flat plane crank, they have a cross plane, but you know, they are fabulous units. But this has the extra sort of charisma and the romance of you know, of being a true Maserati engine, at least a true Maserati engine from that era, from the De Tomaso era. I also find that these earlier cars, they're only very subtle differences, but I think, you know, the bonnet is slightly lower because I think the engine is lower down. So the bonnet shape is slightly different. You have the air scoops at the front. The join between the A and B pillar is seamless. On the later cars, the 4200s, there's a seam there. And of course you have those rear lights, but I do find increasingly these are just beautiful cars. And I think all the better for the original simplicity that these and maybe the early versions of the 4200s had. I don't think that the body kits really were necessary. It's such a pretty shape. Now, while we're dawdling here behind some traffic, let's also confront another issue. Famously, I don't like flappy paddle gearboxes, and I was delighted when this came with the manual, even though I had read that the manual gearbox isn't really that nice. And I can see where those reviewers came from, because it's short of throw, but it's really lumpy and just feels a little bit recalcitrant. It's certainly not. It doesn't feel nice to use, and I think that it really helps that this has such incredible mid-range, because you wouldn't really need to use that gearbox. You certainly wouldn't use it for fun, but I still prefer it because you just still feels like you have more control. It makes it feel like a different car to me, and I actually really rather like this 3200. I thought I might, but there's something about it. They're not as good as the later cars. They just aren't. You know, the engines, the way they deliver power, the 4200s, and the sound that they make is better than this. But as I said, this has the romance of feeling a bit more like a true Maserati. It has a more distinctive character. Well, it's not more distinctive. It has a different character. As a Grand Tourer, it feels a little bit more relaxed. Now, there's different suspension options, I realise that, but it feels a little bit more drivable. The steering is slightly less hyper as well. So I think that this, although still, to me, a bit too overly firm, would make a better GT. I mean, it will pick up very cleanly from fifth gear, from sort of 2000 revs. It does handle incredibly well, but I just wonder really it depends what you expect from a car like this. I would expect a big GT, so most of the time I'd be driving quickly but smoothly, not at the limit. And I think that for that time, I would much rather have, you know, a softer suspension setup, and maybe lose out a little bit when you're right at the limit. Certainly something like an XKR, which was roughly the same price as this and would also have been a competitor, does handle a lot more fluidly, although not with the sharpness and the verve that this has at the limit. I just think though this ride would get you down a little bit eventually. These are still incredible value at between sort of 10 to 20,000 pounds, and I think that they are destined to become more valuable than the Ferrari engine cars. They have those details like the boomerang lights, the fact that it is still a Maserati engine that distinguishes them, and I think that although they are only little aesthetic changes, they do make a difference. So far I've been remarkably positive about this Maserati that has a reputation for being quite flawed. And I think overall it is a better car than you would expect, but there is one more downside that I haven't yet mentioned, and that is the running costs. These are definitely way more expensive to service and to look after than the equivalent Jag or Porsche. Driven normally, they will do about 15 miles to the gallon as well, so they're very thirsty, but also parts and labour, because you only have a few specialists, they are very expensive. So if you're going to get one, you have to make sure that you invest the money to look after them. Generally, the running gear is pretty reliable. The engine and gearbox are fine. You definitely don't want that engine to go though, because if you have to do major work, it is really expensive, but it tends to be the little things that go wrong. But yes, they are not cheap to run, but then such a classy car, I think that it is worth spending the money on them. This one, in this sort of petrol green, looks absolutely spot on and perfect. Roy, who owns it, is going to sell, so I'll put the link in the video description. If you're interested, go and have a look. It looks like a great example, 56,000 miles, feels very sorted, and apart from the little sort of sticky plastic, which isn't too bad, but they all suffer from, seems like a really nice straight car. Thank you all so much for watching. I hugely appreciate it, and I look forward to seeing you for the next video.